Today is a very special program with our Skype meet and greet with our author, Marcus Paul, as he talks about his new book, Ireland to the Wild West. We would like to welcome Marcus to WaKeeney and here in Treaty County, as he is nearly 5,000 miles away and 6 hours ahead of us. So it's a neat distance and a neat technology that we can actually do this with Marcus today. His book describes the journey of his great-grandparents from their home in Ireland and Scotland to America and then on to WaKeeney, as they were some of the first settlers that helped establish WaKeeney and the churches and businesses here in the community. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcus now and to Mary, and we will have the PowerPoint presentation and have questions.
So Marcus, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll let you tell us a little bit about each slide. And the first one is obviously your great-great-grandfather.
That's right, my great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. Okay.
Who was an Irishman from County Monaghan, and he was born straight into the terrible Irish potato famine, which killed, I think, 3 million people, and was a great scandal in British politics and British history. And of course, millions as a result of that did emigrate to the land of the free, your wonderful United States, and they hoped to make a much better living there. Not all of them did, but many did. And James left Ireland at the age of 17, which is pretty young to travel on a very dangerous or potentially dangerous voyage across 4,000 miles of sea. And James made that voyage when he was merely 17, initially to Philadelphia to see friends, but he obviously loved the country and then stayed for years afterwards, of course.
Yes.
And he came to WaKeeney, but only after 4 years of ministry in a church in New Jersey, in Cedarville, in the south of New Jersey. And he brought his wife there. They had quite a tempestuous romance and engagement before they left, but they corresponded by letter because he was away traveling for a lot of the time. Then they married, took the journey, and settled in Cedarville, New Jersey for 4 years before coming out to the West. I think as a result of the great Centennial Exhibition of 1876, which was the world's first trade fair, and was, as you will all know much better than me, an enormous, absolutely enormous event attended by, I think, tens of millions of people from all over the world.
And is there a picture of the, on this side of the street, or is it the, oh, I see the land office building in the lower right-hand corner? Yeah, because I know they had their church services inside Mr. Keeney's office building, didn't they, to start out with?
They did, and as I understand it, the building, I think, is shown in your next slide. Do you have that one?
So, okay.
Yes, on the left of your picture, there's a building saying Commercial House. And as I understand it, though I'm willing to be put right by the historians there, Margene and Larry and everyone else, that that was the building where the first church in WaKeeney ever took place.
And it was also the hotel, yes?
Well, I think it was the land office originally, but in 1878, at least. That's what I've worked out from my researches, but I could be wrong.
No, I'm probably wrong. Margie probably knows better. Did they ever use that as a hotel?
Yes, they did use it as a hotel, but when Wilson's first came,
Oh, okay. She's gonna get the microphone.
when Wilson's first came, there were very few buildings. It was 1878, so there were just a handful of buildings. This picture is 1885, so yes, this corner building would have been the first building that Keeney and Warren put up at that time.
Okay.
Larry?
And we have an account of those very, very early services in Agnes's writing, which she published and which are kept currently in the British Library in London.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the next, yes.
Yes, that's we have your family tree.
Yes, that's right. I've picked out the more relevant names in bold. I don't know whether it's large enough for your audience to see it, but in the middle top line there's John Wilson, 1620, and he married Dolly. They had a son Samuel and then a grandson George, and then you'll see George Wilson's son is Samuel Wilson, who married Margaret Kinnear. And my middle name is Kinnear, and it's a name that runs through for 6 generations or so. And Samuel and Margaret were the parents of James Kinnear Wilson, the young man you saw in the earlier photograph. He married an extraordinary and very talented young lady called Agnes, who came from a well-known family in Edinburgh. And they were the ones who are the central figures in my book, Island of the Wild West, James and Agnes. They had 2 children, and I'm the grandson of their first child, Edina. Edina had Francis Kinnear. Francis Kinnear had Marcus Kinnear, that's me, and my son is called Lawrence Kinnear.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to the next slide.
Okay, this is the only slide with picture we have of the Hateley family. Thomas Ledgerwood Hateley, seated in the middle, was a famous figure in the Scottish church. He started out as being self-taught. He wasn't a clergyman, he was a musician, but he was so talented that he transformed the music of Scotland through the middle years of the 19th century. And there are books and articles about him. And in fact, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the English poet William Blake, but he's a very famous romantic poet. And my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Ledgerwood Hateley, seated here in the middle, was the very first person ever to set William Blake's poetry to music. And on his left, the teenage girl, the young girl, is Agnes. And her brother Walter and her older sister Mary when they were young.
Okay.
And here's a picture of Mary a bit later on, more as she would have been when Agnes was writing to her, I think. Most of the letters are written to Mary. They're not always very easy to read. Agnes's handwriting is very fluent, quite indistinct, and of course the pages are yellowed and the ink is faded. The dark ink at the top is my grandmother's writing when she was collating the letters, and she's written "Arrival in Kansas, a farm of 800 acres bought. Who is the owner now?" The letter was written in 1878, but my grandmother would have written that many years later, probably after the First World War.
And I think you were telling me that she also turned the page over and wrote on the back, so that made it even harder for you to read when you were researching that.
Yes, that is
through there.
that is right, and So there wasn't much paper available, so people would make the best of it and write twice over it. So you turn it through 90 degrees and then continue with your letter and write over your original handwriting. But the other reason, and I only discovered this quite recently, is that letters were costed by weight. And the fact of the matter was that people didn't have very much money, and so Agnes, when she wrote, and she would write maybe 10 sheets of paper, all closely written on both sides, so 20 sheets of handwriting, or sides of handwriting, and if you use twice as much paper, the cost would be twice as much. So she saved money by doing that.
Uh-huh. So,
And she had quite a good eye for drawing. We have one of her paintings of the manse, the parsonage in Cedarville, and I sent you this letter from the Cedarville days, where she describes two elderly widows and dressed entirely in black. And actually, I think you can read the writing there if it's big enough on your screen, where she describes how they are tall, large, and stately, with a deep, rich voice. And then she goes on looking like little Miss Grey of Aberdeen. Both of them great talkers, and she puts this rather delightful little line drawing of them in their with their fans in the heat of the summer in New Jersey, and great big sunbonnets, all dressed in black in the 1870s style.
it's kind of a nice thing to have for your family, or for artwork.
Yeah, that's right. And later on, of course, during the marriage, well, both children were actually born in the parsonage at Cedarville, but it was very shortly after the little boy Samuel was born that when he was only a few months old, that they left to come out to County Trago. And this is the children when they're obviously a little bit older, but still very young. And here is baby Adina just before traveling to Kansas. So she had two very small children to make this long journey with. And actually, although by train it would take only 4 days and 3 nights, actually, because of the difficulty of tickets and because there was no accommodation built for them in WaKeeney, there were only 2 houses on the prairie, 2 dwelling houses when they arrived, and the third one was theirs and it was still being built. So they took 8 weeks to get out from New Jersey to County Trago, Kansas.
They stopped along the way and stayed with friends and had to change railroad lines.
I'm sorry, I missed that, Mary. So,
It was because they had to change railroad lines that weren't in the same towns often, correct?
Yeah, that is right. There were at the time 50 different time standards across the continent, 50 time standards. None of the timetables matched up with each other, and it was only in 1883 that the 4 time zones were standardized, which meant that creating timetables for trains was next to impossible when you moved between states or between railroad companies. And in addition to that, of course, all the tracks were different gauges, so the rolling stock couldn't be transferred from one commercial company to another. You had to stop and not only get into a different train, but all the luggage had to be unloaded. And of course, the immigrant trains were crammed with luggage. It was often lost. And because there were very strict rules about what you could take with you, everything had to be checked. So all the trunks had to be opened. And this took forever, as you can imagine. So it was really a very complicated journey to achieve, especially a young woman who was nursing a baby at her breast and had a toddler alongside him.
And do you know how far apart they were in age?
Yes, I think it was about a year and a half. So Edina was 2 by the time that she made the journey, but Sam was just about 6 months.
And this is Adina grown up, and you said you don't have any pictures of Agnes at this age, but this picture probably would look a lot like Agnes.
That is absolutely accurate from what we know from older photographs and so on. Edina was the spitting image of Agnes, really. Same face shape and the same sort of confident stare, or you can see the slight smile there. And I think she was, both of them were very, very strong-minded young ladies, and certainly when Edina became a grown-up woman, she first of all went to Leipzig to study piano for 3 years, which was a pretty unusual thing. So she went to Germany to study piano on her own for 3 years. And then when my own mother met her as an old lady, as her mother-in-law, she was warned by an American officer, actually, who was in Ireland at the time, because of course your troops were supporting us and they were training in Ireland. The officer took my mother up to the lonely farmhouse where she lived in Northern Ireland. And he said, I won't try to do his accent, but he said, Mrs. Paul, I do hope you realize that the lady you are about to meet is formidable. So she had a tough upbringing, and she became a very tough lady. And that, I think, is the last family photo, because there you see Agnes, aged 80, I think, in the middle, and her very famous son, top left, Samuel Alexander Kinnear Wilson, who became an internationally famous figure. We could talk about him later. Agnes is holding a little boy. She has her left hand firmly gripping his left arm. And that's because he's wriggling about. And I know that because although this was taken in 1929, this little boy, James Kinnear Wilson, is still alive at the age of 98, 99, something like that. And he is the person who kindly wrote the foreword for my book, and he's an academic emeritus fellow of Wolfson College, Cambridge. So very, very clever, like lots of the rest of the family. And I've just mentioned a couple of them there. But Agnes in the middle, the writer of the foreword of the book is the little boy. Sam is top left, and my father, Kinnear Paul, is seated on the ground.
Okay, I misunderstood you before. I thought you had just said that you were that little boy.
No. That would make me 99, I think.
Oh, yeah. What are we looking at now?
This is the page from the British Library, which I was allowed to photograph, and you have to order these books beforehand, because our library is larger than that, of course. You can't just go and find books. But these are extracts from Agnes's writing.
Did she call all of her articles for them letters from Kansas?
Yeah, she wrote, of course, she didn't have very long to write them because of the what happened, but she wrote 3 letters from Kansas, and Mary, you've put those together in a beautiful little collage. Thank you for doing that.
Okay, and then...
Oh, yes, this too. This is one of the things which our family has treasured ever since I can remember, and this was originally silver plated. There's a little bit of silver plate left on the handle, but it's a beautifully engraved Britannia metal silver plated thermos jug. It's double skinned, and could either keep hot things hot or cool things cool. And it was presented to James, as you can see at the bottom, Reverend James Kinnear Wilson, by the church at Cedarville in 1875. It's a great
I never
family
noticed
present.
until just now that his name is on there.
Ah, can you see it on your screen?
I can see it, and, yeah. And you were gonna, I had the question before, it wasn't this James, but you said that your cousin changed his last name to be a hyphenated, well, not hyphenated, but a double last name, Kinnear Wilson.
Yes, that's right. Well, Sam was pretty close to being a genius, and with that goes some quite sometimes eccentric behavior. And one of the little eccentricities was that he didn't just want to be Wilson, and he knew the family name, which is very distinct because it's an unusual spelling, at least in UK, that he wanted it to be Kinnear Wilson. And when he wrote the thesis which made him famous, which was about the discovery of a particular neurological disease for which he got a gold medal and then lots of world tours and so on, he was told, Sam, you're the author now of Wilson's disease. And he replied, no, I'm not. I'm the author of Kinnear Wilson's disease. And he decided to change his name to Kinnear Wilson. So that is, we think that the Kinnear Wilson spent like that is the only family on earth with that particular surname. Oh, and here is Agnes's wedding present from her Edinburgh church in 1874. That's engraved as well with her initials and with a message to James and Agnes from the Free High Church in Edinburgh. And so it's a beautiful 6-piece silver tea service with its own, underneath the kettle there, you can see the heating apparatus and the teapots on the right.
And who in your family does this belong to now?
Well, I, if you like, curate it. I mean, it belongs to me. I'm sitting right underneath it. It's in our attic, just above my head, where I'm seated now. And the same with the Kinnear Wilson jug. So I have the artifacts really in the family now.
Great.
I can when we come onto screen, I could show you one other one which is even older.
Oh, okay. Let me see. I'm going to see if I can go back to you.
Ah, I can see some audience now.
Now I think we can see you.
Well, I can see you, and
Okay.
so can I just take this opportunity, Mary, to say to your audience, thank you very much for having me. And it's a huge privilege to talk to you people and the sort of fulfillment of a dream for me. 20 years of dreaming about being able to discover the history of this extraordinary story about my great-grandparents, and to think that I'm actually talking to people in WaKeeney now, for me, is absolutely extraordinary and very, very special. So thank you very much for coming on your Sunday afternoon and for enabling me to tell you a bit about them. I'm very privileged to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in and or for staying home and talking to us here. We're really enjoying learning about your family. And did you, when you started all this, is that the pastime of doing your family history, is that something that everybody does, or you just had that interest?
It's certainly not something everybody does, and in fact, those who do pursue their family history nearly always simply go through records to find out who lived when and where they died or where they were married and that sort of thing. Very few people write a book. In fact, I think I'm the only person that certainly the only person I know who has published separate memoirs from different presses on their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. So I'm unusual in that respect, but that's because my family were not rich, but very literate. They liked writing. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of letters. And that, when I started to discover these letters, I realized that there was a very interesting story to tell.
I think I'm going to turn it over to Margine to ask you some more questions, or should we start with some audience questions, or do some regular questions for you?
I'm just going to start by holding that up.
Oh.
That is a tea caddy, and in it, my grandmother, Edina, the little girl who went out to WaKeeney, she would remember WaKeeney because she was there long enough to remember it, but this tea caddy belonged to Edina's great-grandmother.
Wow.
So this is very, very old. It's a beautiful inlaid tea caddy. When tea was very, very expensive and had to come from China, they made the most beautiful objects to keep it in, and you can see that it's got a lock on it to stop any servants or other people stealing the tea because it was so valuable.
And did they keep it
this
in
is
canisters inside?
sorry.
Did they use canisters inside there, or that?
There are little. I can just show you. There are little lids for the different types of tea. Yes. So this is Agnes's grandmother's tea caddy.
Very old.
Can I just introduce to you somebody very, very much younger? And I just wanted my wife to come in on the Skype for a moment. This is Elaine.
Lovely. Nice to meet you.
And we've been married for 36, 37 years.
36 years.
36 years. We have 2 children.
It feels like it too.
Well, she has to put up with a lot from me because I'm always disappearing into a library. But it's a privilege for us both to be able to see you and meet with you.
Yeah, and I allowed the tea caddy to come on show because it's really my tea caddy
No,
now.
it's not. It's mine.
You get use out of that then. You get some use out of it then.
Yes, we do.
Oh, yes,
we use it.
every day.
It's on our dresser. We use it for tea.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
it's lovely to meet with you all, and I'm really pleased that Marcus is able to share the fantastic story of his forebears, because it's a very special history. So thank you for giving him this wonderful audience.
Well, thank you. And Margine, do you want to sit here and use this, or you can use that microphone? Okay. And well,
Marcus, I was curious how you found the letters that you use as a reference from Agnes.
Yes, that is quite an interesting question. And it was very exciting for me because I knew that my great-grandparents had done this great journey out to the Wild West. And of course, in European and English culture, for small boys growing up in the 1960s, the Wild West of America was a huge thing. It was, all those cowboys were our sort of heroes. So very, very important part of our culture. And the fact that I'd had a great-grandparent who went out to the Wild West was, for me, very exciting. But we knew nothing about them at all, certainly nothing about him. We knew that he died young, and it was all rather tragic in that respect, but that there were no other records. But I started digging into the family archives and wading through cardboard boxes full of letters and crackly old yellow newspapers and documents. And I found an obituary, which my grandmother had kept, of my great-grandfather, who came to WaKeeney. And so this set me on a bit of a trail. And the next thing I knew was that a cousin of mine had responded to my questions and said, "I found some more letters." And he was searching through the name Kinnear Wilson, this very unusual name, on the internet, and found that some letters by a Kinnear Wilson had been sold by the Swan Gallery in New York to University of Yale for $5,000. And he found out that they were our great grandmother's letters. We don't know who sold them, but they were bought by Yale for quite a large sum, and they were curated in their rare manuscript and Americana library, the Beinecker Library. So I wrote off to Yale and said, "Look, I'm really interested in these. I'm the great-grandson. Is there any way I can see these?" And they said, "Well, we can sell you some PDF copies." And so I bought them and then spent a very long time, months, deciphering hundreds and hundreds of pages of letters, and the story unfolded from there.
It's amazing that you even found those letters. That's kind of
Yeah, we don't know who sold them, but we're very grateful that they were sold, because otherwise they'd probably be sitting in a box in somebody's loft.
Yes, and as we know, that's letters are one of the direct evidence or a really good research find for anything, for historical research and family research as well.
I think letters are the best of all, because especially, of course, in the old days, letters were expensive to post, or at least, they took a long time. And therefore people had to wait for love letters or letters of news, and their emotions got very pent up, and they got very fearful when the letter didn't arrive, or misunderstandings could happen because you can't speak to somebody, you can only see their writing, so you don't understand what they've said. Maybe a joke went wrong, and so on and so forth. And therefore letters, yes, are the very best of all historical sources. But I'm speaking as an amateur, and you have some wonderful historians with you. And in addition to thanking Mary and Margine for setting this up, I must thank Larry Hickson, who has done some wonderful research for me. And Larry, I'm most grateful to you for your work. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's good. That's good.
Does anybody have a question?
Yeah, in 1878, the Northern Tribune decided to go home from Reno, Oklahoma, and they came through Kansas, and I don't know if there's any mention of any of those in his letters.
Marcus, we had a gentleman that wants to know if you mentioned, they haven't bought the book yet, about the Indian Raid of 1876 in your book.
Yes, I do. May I just say that the Indian Raid was 1878, but yes, I do. I have a whole chapter on that, because this is one reason why Yale was so interested in the letters, because they do significantly add the atmosphere in WaKeeney at the time. And Agnes writes a long letter, and I quote the entire letter in the book, and then talk about it and talk about that Indian raid, which as I understand it, was an exodus from the reservation in Oklahoma as the Northern Cheyenne tried to return to their homelands in the north. And it's quite a sad episode in a way, I'm sure we agree, but it was absolutely fascinating to read Agnes's account of what happened, and she had to evacuate the house. And the story she tells is, completely gripping, because it all happened one dark, foggy night, and James, her husband, was away. She was alone in the house with 2 infants, and a man with a gun came to the door and knocked on it, and she was in bed, and she heard the word Indians, and she had to get these children awake, dressed, and rush down for the train. I think it was the 2 a.m. train that night. And James, when he arrived at the door in the darkness, in that autumn, or what we would call autumn night, said only 4 words to her. He arrived at the door, he rushed in, saw her trembling there, and he said these 4 words: "Get ready to go." And they rushed down to the station, to the depot, to the station, which bordered their land. Their house had some acreage which went right down to the rail tracks. And he pushed her aboard and sent her east to Russell. And then in the letter, she talks about what was happening in Russell as well at the time, and so on and so forth. And all of this is in the book. And even since writing the book, I've continued to research that, and it's very interesting. But Agnes's letter is unique in that it tells a story that nobody else has told about what happened at WaKeeney.
So why was she at home alone with?
James was on church business over at Russell. He'd gone down the tracks, and either Russell or Hayes, I forget for the moment, and was just away. And as he was a pastor who had educational responsibility over 8 districts, and so he was the inspector of schools, as well as being a pastor who spoke in other people's churches.
And I'm not sure if we said that he was the first Presbyterian minister in WaKeeney, but as you just said, he was the first superintendent also.
Yes, that's right. And he's listed in, Larry found a news, or actually, can't again for the moment, perhaps whether it's Larry or Mary found the paper. I think, Mary, you sent it to me, in which he is listed as one of the County Trago officers, the superintendent of schools, and his name's in that newspaper you sent me.
And what do you think he taught school as well, do you think?
I think he probably didn't teach school, but I think he went round to inspect them. His plan was to not just run the church in WaKeeney, but we have the letter from Warren and Keeney in Chicago, and in that it says, please find a particular place for Mr. Wilson, because if he comes, a great circle of acquaintance will follow him from the east. And of course, they wanted to sell off land and develop the area, so they wanted James to come. And his intention is to develop the religious instincts of the area and found churches. So it's in the plural that Warren and Keeney write this letter about James and providing, a place for him.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the ocean journey to get over to America?
Well, am I talking too much, Mary?
No.
Okay, as long as people aren't falling asleep. The ocean journey, we don't know anything very much about for them personally, but we know a lot about voyaging the Atlantic at that time. I've worked out the exact dates of their voyage, and almost certainly the ship that they traveled in, which would have been SS Ohio, or one of the 2 sister ships which were built alongside her. These were the largest ships built in America to that date. But it was still a very dangerous voyage because they were coal-fired. And for instance, in 1873, the year before, only months before they themselves sailed, and they were sailing at the worst time of the year for storms, the largest civil shipping disaster of the century happened when 185 people were drowned off, I think, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, one of those two. And the reason for it was that the weather was so bad that they realized that their 967 tons of coal was not going to get them to New York. So they had to therefore put it into a port to get more coal. And if the wind and the waves are against you, the engines have to work harder, you need to fuel them up more, you run out of fuel. And they're in danger of running out of fuel. They had to go into a more dangerous area, and the ship sank in mountainous seas, losing all 585 lives, I think. And again, the details of that are in the book. But it was a very dangerous time. And for instance, for iceberg, we all know about the Titanic, of course, in 1912, and how that was sunk by an iceberg. But do you know how they judged whether an iceberg was around or not? Of course, they had no sonar, no radar, nothing, no means of knowing whether it's an iceberg. And the icebergs came out of the fog. That was the problem. You couldn't see them ahead. And the way they judged whether there was an iceberg would be to put a thermometer in the water and trail it alongside the ship to see whether or not the temperature was dropping. And if the temperature was dropping, they knew they were in danger of iceberg. But they wouldn't see it, and at night they could see nothing. And the only way they could warn other ships that they were there in the darkness or in the fog was by means of a steam whistle. But these ships weighed 1,000 or more tons. These were huge steel ships. They had sails still, but they had engines as well, and they could use either. But they were massive ships. And of course, if one ploughed into the other, it would cut it in half. And they had no means of telling if a ship was coming in the fog or the dark other than a steam whistle, and no means of warning against icebergs other than a thermometer.
It's amazing. And I had wondered, Marcus, how did Agnes get to be an published author as well? Was that just a normal thing for wives of preachers to get an opportunity to be a published writer?
No, I think it was probably unusual. And of course, although Britain was famous in the 19th century for a small number of women novelists, people like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, obviously most authors were men, and most pastors' wives didn't write articles and books. But Agnes was a good writer. She wrote well, and you'll be able to see that if you can read any of the paragraphs from her articles, or indeed if you read the letters in the book, you see that she writes well. But she had another advantage as well, and that was that I think I should say her work deserved to be printed and published, but that the editor of the Family Treasury of Sunday Reading, which was a very popular thing for Christian families to read on Sundays in Scotland, the editor was William Arnott, and William Arnott married them, and he was a family friend through her father and so on, and Arnott probably encouraged James to come out to America because he had been to various American conferences on behalf of his church in Scotland. So William Arnott was really the link there.
And was it his son that came out later to?
Yes, well, in the letters, he's only referred to as Willie, but by elimination, I think it must be Willie Arnott, and that is the son. And James gave some of the acres of his farm to Willie Arnott, but I don't know whether we've been able to trace any record of it yet.
That's great. Does anybody else have any questions? They want to, I can hand you the microphone. I was going to ask you also about you didn't mention about Agnes's singing career. She was amazing, an amazing singer, it sounds like.
Well, she was, and we do have some evidence of that because of the records in her letters of what she sang. And so in my research, I looked up the music that she sang, and it's very difficult. My wife, Elaine, who you met a few minutes ago, is a very good singer and has sung solo parts and sung in some very good choirs. But we've looked at Agnes's choice of songs when she put on concerts and sang solos, and they are some of the songs are very difficult. Again, they're named in the book, and if you were to look on the internet or go to a library and find these songs, some are folk songs, but some are arias from opera, and I think she had an almost operatic voice and was very, very good. In fact, she also studied in Leipzig, and all told, either for medicine or for music, about 6 members of my family have studied in Leipzig.
So not only Agnes, but James also traveled Europe when he was right before he got married.
Yes, he did. And that I think annoyed Agnes very considerably because he'd already been to Princeton, and then he went to college in Chicago. Then he went to Scotland to New College in Edinburgh, which was a prestigious new college that had been founded, and ended up at Auburn Seminary in New York. So he did 4 different college degrees or courses, like short courses perhaps, 3 after he'd been to Princeton. But having fallen in love with Agnes, he then decided that he wanted to do the grand tour of Europe. And so off he went to France and to Italy in particular. And Agnes writes to him in Italy, telling him what things he's got to see, because she says she doesn't think that James is very good at looking at things. So Agnes bosses him about and says, this is what you've got to go and see. And he spends a long time out there, and Agnes gets very fed up with him for doing that, and they have various rows in their letters, which are quite fun to read, but all must have been very painful at the time. She says to him, "You stupid boy," once, and various other things like that, and then he apologizes, and then she apologizes, and so it goes on. They have this sort of rather tempestuous, stormy love affair, but then get married, and about a few weeks later they cross the Atlantic.
And so, Marcus, you write other books as well.
Yes, I have done.
On your website.
Yes, I've got one of them here. The title is a bit fierce, but this is The Evil That Men Do. That was 2016. And my first book was privately printed, but I called it Letters from 5 Continents because it's a big book, 107,000 words. But this was, I have family letters going back over the generations from Europe, America, Australia, India, and the 5th continent, I'm just trying to say, and Africa. So all these letters I spent at least a year reading and researching, and I thought, and this is what I say to you folks, if I dare say anything to you at all, is that if you've got some lovely memories of your childhood or your younger years, do write them down, because otherwise the generations are like ships that pass in the night and they see each other but they don't speak. And I determined, a while back that I was determined to stop this, and I would collect up everything and for my children and cousins and other people, and get it into a history. And in fact, our family goes back to about 1272. But unless you keep the documents and write things down, nobody will ever know. And then when your grandchildren are your age, they will say, I wish I'd talked to Granny. I wish I'd asked her that question. And now it's too late. I can't. And these days it's so easy to do, because we can just speak into microphones and things will type it for us. You can speak into your mobile phone these days and it'll type for you.
That's true. So, well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Marcus, what you just said, I have told my board members and my fellow Historical Society members to do that very same thing, to write everything down. So we have it as a record for our county history. So I'm glad you reiterated that.
That's so important. So we often feel that our childhood is not very important, but to our grandchildren, our childhood will be important. It would be fascinating and historic and important, and give wonderful insights to the past. And all you folk there have these fantastic memories of things that you did when you were young, and it's just so worth recording. It's a really important part of social history that we do that. And if nobody had done that, there wouldn't be any domestic or social history. And of course, just the last thing on that is, in the age of the email, all these emails, I assure you, will be lost. They will not keep in the way that paper documents will. Paper is the best technology for recording things. If you think about floppy disks, about the different ways in which we used to record things electronically, none of them are compatible now. Nothing lasts. The only thing that lasts is paper. Electronic recording does not last. And besides that, there will be so many that photographs, so many documents, all on hard drives, nobody will be able to find them or wade through them. But if you've got a 30-page document of writing with a title on the front, it goes into a bookcase, that will be there forever.
We did talk about that before too, and that's great. I think. Thank you for telling us that again, because that is important. And also, I wanted to share that we do have copies of your book here, and thank you so much for. You wrote a personal letter to anybody that wants to buy your book, so that we can get your signature, because we got them straight from the publisher. And
yes,
you didn't have a chance to sign them first, but if people would like to buy that book, then we have your signature with that.
Well, thank you. And I made a little comment for each person on that note, and then individually signed them all and sent them over to Mary. So they're not photocopies; they are my original signature. But I do just want to say thank you again to you all, and also that I would, when I can save sufficient funds, I really want to visit WaKeeney. I very much want to come and meet you, and to see the high plains and see places where my forebears were, and to meet you lovely people and see your town.
Well, thank you. We would love to have you.
Hey, Marcus, I have one more question, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, but why did Agnes leave WaKeeney?
Why did she leave WaKeeney? Well, I don't want to give a spoiler to the book, but something happened which was very, very dramatic. I don't know if everybody knows that or not, but I am sort of keeping that up my sleeve in a way. There was a tragedy which meant that she really had no choice but to go back to Scotland. But the book although there's a really tragic, and people who have read it have said that, you know, they almost cried when they read that chapter. The book does have a happy ending because something quite extraordinary happened. I think, you know, really quite extraordinary happened when she went back to Edinburgh. And although she had a huge tragedy in her life as a minister's wife, I think she was able to say that God was good to her because he had provided for her in her grief.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, I don't want to give away the ending either. Does anybody else have any questions?
We'll give you the microphone.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. He's only nearly 5,000 miles away to answer it. We want to know, is there any follow-up books related to this?
Yes, that is a good question. I don't think I can pursue this any further. I think the story is complete in itself. And although there are other people that I could write more about in my family, I don't think there is very much more I can find out, unless Larry finds out something quite else extraordinary, such as that when 10 years after leaving, Agnes still hadn't paid for something. Is that right, Larry?
Yes.
Larry said yes. Yes, it was in the paper, Larry said.
Marcus, I can try and explain to this group where the city block was that they had the home on next to the railroad tracks.
Yes,
And
please.
I can try and explain to them where the 800 acres was, 8 miles out of town. I was able to find that out too.
Please do so, Larry. I'd love to hear your voice and to hear more about that. Please tell everybody, everybody.
Well, the city block was just down the street, 1 block east. And it's the block where I call it the old Paul Applegate house and all those homes are. It goes from there down to the railroad tracks. And then the 800 acres was out east of town. If any of you are familiar, where Ethel Hillman and Dale Hillman had a farm out there of 6 quarters. Well, if you take the south half section and go across the road to the west, that's a half section right in there that I know that it's in the paper. That's what apparently they fell behind on paying the railroad for all the interest on it, and they had a sheriff's sale, and it was all recorded in the paper, and that's one of the reasons I found it. And it's the place where the Schubert kids grew up on. That's some of the things I learned.
Yes, that is very interesting. And should I come out, Larry, you're going to have to show me this place. And you farmed right across the road from there, did you not?
Yes. For many years I had Ethel Hillman's ground right across the road east of it. You're right. She describes it in there with a beautiful stream going through it, and it's the nicest clear water stream around that I knew in this part of the county.
Does it still have fish in it? Because James, when he arrived, used to fish there and catch a lot of fish.
I seriously doubt that there's enough water, enough pools there now to have any fish in it. I wondered the same thing, but I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you very much for doing that research and for telling everybody about it. I'd love to see it.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Marcus, do you have any questions for us?
Well, that's what I felt I did want to ask. I mean, is there anything much left in the town from the earliest days?
Very few of the original buildings are still here.
With the exception of one, the Oaks House, or the hotel that Agnes refers to as being, I think that hotel was on the corner when she even landed in town. And the old part of that has been covered up with plaster and brick, but you can see a few spots now where the stone is starting to show through. And that hotel is just right across the street from where we're sitting right now.
So where did people get the stone from the stone buildings? Can you just get it out of the prairie or what?
There are several outcroppings of stone in various spots, either north of town a few miles or several miles south of town. Unfortunately, much of our stone here is very soft, and it's pretty solid when they first take it out, but when you get it into a building and if it gets wet, then when it gets cold it freezes and it tends to just crumble up. Whereas you go east of here 60 miles, you get into some much harder stone from there on east.
And when you look out from the edge of town, when you come to the edge of WaKeeney, is it still prairie? Is it, unchanged in that respect, or is it all somehow very different? Because obviously 1878, it was buffalo grass to the very door of the house because there was nothing.
There you go.
Of course, buffalo grass was one of the original grasses here, and when the buffalo grazed, they grazed out some of the meat grasses, and that's come back into some of the pastures that are here now. Like side oats grama and blue grama, yeah, those come back into some of these pastures now. That probably when right in the early, when there was all the buffalo, they did what you call overgrazing, and the result was most of what was left was buffalo grass.
Okay, thank you.
In your book, Agnes mentions the stone house that the Warrens built and that she had been over to their home.
Yes.
There is still grass, native grass, that comes up within a few yards of what's left of this stone house. So some of this native pasture still exists.
Okay, right, that's very interesting. That's very historic, yes. But otherwise, it's still a prairie and it's not built up outside town. It's just open prairie.
Most of the ground that was somewhat flat has been all broken up, so it's not prairie anymore. It's all farmland, and they raise wheat and corn and milo, and that's the main crops that are raised here. And it's all dry land. There's very little irrigation around here.
Of course, this part of the world at one time was the bottom of an ocean. So they built up limestone, and the deeper soils are being farmed, and you go through a road cut and you can see the native grasses over a shallow, not too far down to limestone. So there are a lot of acres of grass still left.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I've seen some photos of as much as I can on the computer, but of course it's a very different thing to be there, and I'd like to see it myself.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions? Marcus, do you have any other questions?
What's the weather like with you?
Mid 40s today and slight rain. That's what we're having right now.
Okay, because either Mary or Margene mentioned to me that they were hoping for a snow day to read the book, and of course, somehow I don't think of snow over in Kansas, but I guess you get snow.
Yes, we can have some lovely blizzards and good snow days. And that was me because I have to go to work all the time, so I need a snow day to stay in.
Okay, right. Well, of course, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the library and the museum and all the artifacts and so on and so forth at some stage. So that would be a great privilege for me to see that. And thank you to everybody who has helped me with photographs and documents and all things that have gone to make up the book. And I'm most grateful to you. And Larry and Margine and Mary are mentioned in the endorsements that you kindly gave to me in the book. So thank you for that.
Well, you're
Thank
welcome.
Thank you for coming.
Doing the Skype meet and greet 5,000 miles and 6 hours ahead of us today. We really appreciate this, and this is exciting to have a book with personal documentation of WaKeeney's very early days, and we don't have a lot of that documentation, and with your book, we have that now, and we really appreciate it. As the Historical Society, we'd like to thank the library for working with us on this project. And Larry Hickson was a big part of this, and we really thank him for his contribution to the book and finding all the little tidbits that we needed to add today. So, and thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
And thank you. I wish you all the best for the future, and maybe I'll get out to see you one day, and I would very, very much like that privilege and would look forward to it enormously. So thank you, and thank you for this afternoon's meeting with you all. It's a great special moment for me.